You see, the thing is, Brian, that God is a hateful God. Must be. Because if God is good, then why is there evil in the world? Why is there pain and hate and greed and war? Doesn't make sense. But if God is a nasty bastard, then you can say, why is there good in the world? Why is there love and hope and joy? Well, let's face it, good exists in order to be fucked up by evil. The very existence of good enables evil to flourish. Therefore, God is bad. And it doesn't matter how many past or future existences you have, because they're all going to be riddled with grief and anguish and sickness and death. You see, Brian, God doesn't love you. God despises you. So there's no hope. And mankind is just a component of the device by which the devil creates itself. You with me? You see, what I'm saying basically is you can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs, and humanity is just a cracked egg, and the omelette stinks.
What a Gnostic harangue, eh? The clip is from the 90s meta film, Naked. And thanks for bringing it to my attention, Alec. And it's from the mouth of the dude who plays Mars in Wonder Woman. So true, don't you think? So what do we do? What do we do? I mean, here we are, outcasts in a world we did not create, in a reality we tend to hate. Lost and alone, so far away from home. Never belonging and always kicking against the goads of a hostile society. Trying to remember the lost song of a goddess called Sophia, and wondering if our memories are our own or implanted by some parasite god. But always leaning on our art making and parody and tearful empathy to get through the day and help others in this cosmic Amazon warehouse. And knowing only a spiritual solution works, and we are in a spiritual war, raging against heaven and storming the gates of hell for our misplaced childhoods and paradises lost.
As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
Well, I was talking about the ancient Gnostics, but perhaps you can relate. I'm sure you can, or you wouldn't have materialized at the virtual Alexandria, here at AM by Gnostic Radio. This is no accident, and you are no accident, but a bound Prometheus just about to break the shackles of conformity, the average, and conditioning. Ready to steal fire from the creator gods and their doxed butt slaves in the establishment.
There are very few things that I will defend with true passion. Medical marijuana, the biblical Satan as a metaphor for rebellion against tyranny, and motherfucking goddamn cryptocurrency.
It was William Blake who wrote In the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I have always found that angels have the vanity to speak of themselves as the only wise. This they do with a confident insolence, sprouting from systematic reasoning. And this attitude has been trickling down for billions of years. And here we are, a humanity on the brink of destroying all that brings wonder and bring down the stars of innocence into the dark oceans of ignorance. In relation, I like this recent quote by Caitlin Johnstone on the rulers of this age. It's not their lies that poison us. It's that they get us to lie to ourselves, convincing ourselves to believe the status quo is better than change, arguing on behalf of the powerful against the weak, gaslighting ourselves into believing lies are truth and truth is imagination. Of course, I would say there is nothing wrong with truth being imagination. in a Blakean context. Regardless, the quote reminds me of this one by Thomas Pynchon. If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers.
A new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia, where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or to even see it as a prison.
What a mess, how the angels keep us in this world and against one another. But we now know, and we are waking up like the ancient Gnostics. We are legend and we are beautiful. We are writing our own gospel and living our own myth, because freedom is what we want most. So glad you're here with me, Abraxas, in his meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor. No longer broadcasting at the frigid and lawful dystopia of Chicago, but these days in the Illinois country near a town called Wakanda. I am your pompatus of gnosis, that smell of colitas rising through the air of a world gone mad. Insane in the Yog-Sothoth membrane.
Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
Like I keep saying, Gnosis is the best spiritual tech to fully awaken in these days of cosmic fake news and alternative facts, trickling down like some infernal Reaganomics from Jehovah himself. Gnosis, yes, that knowledge of the heart, as Quills Gespel called it. When hope dies, imagination must live. And no one imagined both worse worlds and better heavens than the Gnostics. And it has become manifest, certainly on this August, the year of our demiurge 2018.
We're all monkeys.
So to continue escaping this prison planet, let us cultivate our gnosis. And a way to do this is to continue understanding the Gnostic impulse, for better or worse, in these modern times. I can't think of anyone better than Matthew Dillon, a true sage of modern Gnostic thought, an august anthropologist of modern esoterica. I've truly enjoyed interacting with Matt throughout the years and was honored to give a paper by his side last April at the Gnostic America Conference at Rice University. Matt is a religion professor at DePauw University, with some very game-changing books on the horizon. Get ready for some modern Gnostic cult leaders like David Icke, John Lamb Lash, and more. Get ready for a deeper understanding of the archons, as well as their relation to extraterrestrials. And get ready for some Gnostic savants like Philip K. Dick and Grant Morrison, and more. And how all of this is baked into modern conspiracies, our cultural paranoia, and just how we are indeed living in Gnostic times.
This is conspiracy paranoia.
The issue isn't whether you're paranoid, Lenny. The issue is whether you're paranoid enough.
Something I should add. In one section, we discuss how certain Gnostic figures like Philip K. Dick, Carl Jung, and Grant Morrison blurred the lines of fiction and their material existences. Very much like the ancient Gnostics did when you think about it. Matt and I forgot to mention about one section in the Invisibles, dealing with the meeting of the Archons and King Mob, who is the fictional alter ego of Grant Morrison. In that section, the Archons captured King Mob and tried to get him to admit he is in the rebellious occult organization, the Invisibles. They torture him, slashing him all over, beating him until his lung collapses, and injecting bacteria in his cheek. In real life and soon after, Grant Morrison fell ill with what turns out to be an undiagnosed staph infection, which led to bacteria in his cheek and a collapsed lung. Sick with fever and desperately in need of a doctor, Morrison hallucinated and experienced what he called a, quote, Christ vision. Yes, we can all write our own gospel, and we can all live our own myth with some gnosis by tapping into our godly imagination. The lines are blurred to get us out and start asking the right questions.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
I should also mention that by the time the show is released, I will be working a new day job. Yay! That means I'll be onboarding and going through some info dump and so forth, as I sell my soul to corporate America to feed the little angels at home. So there might be a bit more of a lag in between shows, but worry not, I'll get back in a rhythm and already have some riveting episodes coming out late summer and early fall. I will always work at giving you the content to help you find that mystery that works for you and only you. So please don't go anywhere until the fat Aeon sings. We've only just begun.
Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. But tonight, we dine in hell!
Speaking of riveting content, we will also include for members, beyond the full show, our Trimorphic Paranoia, where the Moondog Vance, a guest, and I offer a commentary on the interview. This time we are joined by Miguel Angel Sanchez, the artistic and writing force behind Starfish, Light the Dark, a truly amazing Gnostic graphic novel just released and I really enjoyed. Perfect for our topic with Matt.
It's like God's vagina.
Let us end with a quote from John Steinbeck from East of Eden that exemplifies all that I've been saying, all that is going on in this terra damnata, and all that we as true seeker warriors are all about. And this I would fight for, the freedom of the mind to take any direction it wishes, undirected. And this I must fight against. Any idea, religion, or government which limits or destroys the individual. This is what I am and what I am about. The empire never ended. This is the AM Byte interview, and with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Matthew Dillon. How are you doing today, Matthew?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Miguel?
I'm doing great, and as we talked before the interview, this is overdue. You're someone who I've definitely wanted to interview for a long time, and of course, we've had the pleasure of meeting a few times and interacting throughout the years, so this is definitely the friendly discussion I've been looking for a while. So again, thanks for being here.
Yeah, no, it's great. Long-time listener, first-time caller, whatever that phrase is now. So yeah, this should be good.
Indeed. So speaking of meeting, we met last April at the Gnostic America conference, and I thought it was incredible. I've been able to have Mitch Horowitz on the show, and definitely other guests since there, like Jeff Kripal, of course. So, but I wanted to get your takeaway from the Gnostic America conference. What did you think of it?
I thought it was great. When you throw those thematic conferences, it can be sort of hit or miss, in that you don't know if everybody's going to be on the same page, or they're going to be coming at things from a reasonably similar angle. And the thing that was cool about Gnostic America conference, I thought, was that there was a lot of overlap, like thematically, in terms of dialogue. There was a very sort of rich conversation to be had, but it also wasn't redundant, right? Because there was just so much material that everybody could sort of come from these different directions. And it raised some pretty interesting questions, I thought, hearing that, right? Because a lot of the issues in sort of the Gnostic Renaissance or Neo-Gnosticism, what have you, concern this issue of, does Gnosticism have to be anti-cosmic and dualist, right? Or can it be sort of pro-cosmic and Neoplatonic, that sort of thing? Or what is the relationship of Gnostics to the body, right? And how is that playing out today, pro-body or anti-body? And we were seeing all these sort of different manifestations of that in the different papers. And so I thought that led to a pretty rich discussion. And obviously the people at Rice, they do an awesome job with those conferences, and it was very laid back and casual, which is the best.
Yeah, I agree with you. It really was a good time and a lot to think about. And some of the best discussions were away from the lectures at Valhalla or at another pub or at the restaurants. It was just flowing, and it was just wonderful to see how relevant Gnosticism or Gnostic thought is in this country and the formation of the West and all that. But I guess the question is, what makes Rice University, their religious department, so unique, which is where something like Gnostic America Conference can come out of, and that's the GEM program. Could you tell the audience a little bit about this? You're very acquainted with it, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I am one of the first people to enter in when the GEM program started. So I don't know if it started officially in 2008 or 9. I started in 9. And so it was a move by the department as a whole, but specifically Jeff Kreipel and April DeKonig, who have been on your show many times. They were also the advisors on my dissertation. And so what they started to do is when they had an open chair or they would have an open hire, they'd often look for somebody who focused on mystical content or Gnosticism or esotericism. And so they brought in people that study in the Middle Ages, that obviously there's the Tibetan Buddhist scholar who's already there, Anne Klein. They brought in a Jewish mysticism specialist, things like that. So there's a very sort of important focus on GEM within that department, obviously. And so with that, you, as somebody like me who studied ancient Gnosticism and contemporary spirituality, you get all these different perspectives from, again, Jewish mysticism and Islamic mysticism, psychoanalytic mysticism, all these sorts of things. And it's also a very well-funded department. So they've been able to put on a conference of similar to Gnostic America probably once every year or two. Right, and there were at least 5 of them while I was a graduate student that were great. And then the last thing that I would point out is that those of us who are sort of captivated by the Gnostic or the esoteric or the mystical are not the center of religious studies, right? It's sort of marginal.
Right.
And so it's really rewarding to have a number of graduate students and professors, all of whom are, enthusiastic and kind of obsessed in a way with this material. Leads to some really great conversations, as you said, like at Valhalla or in classrooms or just walking around, right? So it's a really special place. I'm happy I got to go there.
Yes, this is in your grandma's religious study department. Very progressive, very innovative.
Indeed, yeah.
Very contemporary, and it's wonderful to see that coming out and scholars like yourself coming out that really have their hands on the pulse of how modern spirituality is evolving based on ancient spirituality. And there were some great takeaways. One that, of course, you mentioned a couple that made you think, like, should Gnosticism be, anti-cosmic? Can it be pro-cosmic? Can it be positive? Of course, there was debates about this, but one that was very interesting to me is Eric Davis when he said, if you take away the archons from Gnosticism, all you get is perennialism. What did you think about that? Did that affect you? Did you think about that, Matthew?
Yeah.
And you two had lots of beers afterwards, so I'm sure you discussed this.
Yeah, so and before, and many before. Eric and I, our times had Rice overlapped. So, yeah, it's a long conversation.
In the program.
Yes, yeah. And so we had been talking about this for actually a couple months, because we both realized, we're talking about the Archons. We should make sure that we're not being redundant or overlapping. And so we got into this dialogue. And so that particular statement, I think, is an important one. It can shade into perennialism or what have you. And this is, I see it in terms of Western religion, is you go back and you have, within the 20th century and back into the early 19th, actually, this idea of a tradition of gnosis, right, that includes the Gnostics, that incorporates them. But it's very much focused on transcendent knowledge, on revelation, by the 20th century experiences of the deep self, right? And it largely ignores the Archons, right? Sometimes it subdues them and just makes them psychological processes or something like that. But if you're really getting sort of down and dirty in the ancient Gnostic literature, you can't avoid the Archons, right? Particularly if you're interested in the sort of mythology of it and what are classified as Sethian texts, because Seth is taken as revealer and savior, and those sort of Adam and Eve stories, etc. The Archons are there. They are fundamental to how that, if you call it spirituality or gnosis, plays out. And so if we're going to try and look for a revival or some sort of resonances with the ancient world, we have to look there, right? The Archons are essential. Otherwise, we can start talking about, Rosicrucianism and Hermeticism and the larger esoteric tradition. But this is a bit more precise, right? If we're really trying to locate ourselves in like late 1st to the early 4th century.
Yes, indeed. I mean, because obviously the ancients, from Mithras to Merkabah Jews, assume that they're these sort of managerial angels. Paul, of course, sees that as well, and everything else. But I think the Gnostics, especially as you say, the Sethians, really weaponize the Archons, really move the goalposts where, like, this is some serious shit now.
Yeah, and I mean, they're having sort of Archons like as just rulers, right? Or as these sort of leaders, like you said, angelic figures in the planets, that's already there. But to have it become this completely totalizing worldview, where the Archons are responsible for, not just our bodies and material reality, but wove together our souls. So every part of us, our emotions, desires, our sort of physical ailments, all of that is trying to keep us sort of trapped and forgetful of our gnosis, of who we truly are, etc. And the point being to find a way to escape, get out of this prison, get out of those planets. Like, that's a very peculiar thing, right? Like it's a very serious thing, and they're also very funny, right? Don't get me wrong. Like, the ancient Gnostics can be hilarious too. Like, it's pretty funny, but it's dark, right? It is dark stuff, and that sort of taking that seriously, I think, is something that comment from Eric is important.
For my next question, Matthew, I sort of had a speech, but then I thought to myself this morning, I said, wait a second, Matthew, more than me, has really been studying how Gnosticism and modern culture, even ancient culture, have walked together or affect each other and everything else. So I'm just going to put out this question, which I've asked to other guests, and other guests we've done shows with it, with Christopher Knowles and Gordon White. But here's the question. Are we living in Gnostic times, and is this a Philip K. Dick world?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's good to think on. So, and just to sort of preface this a little bit, so my overriding specialization, just for viewers who are listeners, who aren't familiar with my work, I study the reception of ancient Gnostic texts, ideas, and symbols in contemporary America. Right. So this is obviously a part of my daily work. I think that there's something to be said for that. Right. So in the 90s, we had this tremendous resurgence, right, of interest in the sort of Gnostic story. And it came out primarily in films, right, with, everything from Dark City, Existence, Truman Show, eventually The Matrix. You also had Grant Morrison at that time writing The Invisibles. And so what was happening at that time? There's been different answers to that, but one of the really important things is that the introduction of the computer, and this is something you see Dick wrestle with too, gives this whole sort of what would I say? Or actually, it's Victoria Nelson who points this out, that it opens up the possibility of another world again. We're not just inside our own minds. Right? We're not just talking about the unconscious in some way. We can really start talking about this other space. And so that happens in the 90s, and that's really important. But we see it coming back in a much more kind of archontic way, right, today, which I think is really fascinating. So if we think in terms of these really dark conspiracy theories, like you see come out of David Icke or John Lamb Lash or elsewhere, this is, or pardon me, let me retract. So, or these more recent shows and films that are doing this in a somewhat different way. Like, I think some people are split on this new season of Westworld. I think it's one of the most interesting Gnostic things that's come around in a while.
Oh, agreed.
Actually, it's really, really cool. And so in talking in terms of Gnostic times, the things that both Westworld, Altered Carbon, right, whatever the movie was with Matt Damon a few years back, Elysium, right? Part of what they're pointing to in terms of Gnostic times is that today we're sort of witnessing how there's been, since the 80s, and now it's really severe, this massive wealth disparity. Like, it's incredibly severe, right? Anybody who's taken Economics 101 can sort of see that graph.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so we're starting to feel that, right, in a very serious way. And so that radical difference between the rich and the poor is sort of felt again. And then you think in terms of technology, and this is something that Westworld is doing really well, is technology is at a point where it's completely totalizing and inescapable, right? It's hard to leave the house without your phone, and it becomes this kind of obsession, right? Like, I'm talking on my phone right now, but I'm still getting that urge to look at my phone and go on Twitter and get that little dopamine surge, right? Or you buy something on Amazon and they're going to keep telling you or showing you, oh, you could buy this, you could buy that, you could buy this, right? These are ways of sort of nourishing or captivating our appetites, right? So that's, again, a Gnostic sort of idea of being trapped in the material or trapped those sorts of ways. And yeah, I think the sort of totalizing idea, the fact that we have the politics stretch all over the globe, these things are very archontic in the sense that, the regional is subsumed by these larger forces now, right? And it sort of lends itself to that Gnostic myth in a way, I think.
Well said. Yeah, I think I would agree. I think it's, I don't know how to put it. I think it's not that we are increasingly use the Gnostic language, but I think culture's starting to see with the Gnostic eyes, as you point, the idea that people are realizing we do live in an unfair world. We are trapped by these shadowy people at the top, whether it's corporations or heaven. And, it just fits well. I mean, Philip K. Dick is more popular than ever. You might say, technosis really works well for our culture. As we'll talk, and you've written too, the right has really adopted the language of Gnosticism or the Matrix with red pilling. You hear the word archons used even in 4chan, or about these individuals, which we hopefully will discuss soon, like David Icke and so forth. I mean, even someone like Jordan Peterson, he's really given Carl Jung a shot in the arm with his, he advocates him. And of course, eventually that's going to lead to even more Gnostic thought. So it really seems like it's out in the air. Were you surprised at such a change? Because I was reading your work when there was this Gnostic revival, as you said, in the 90s and so forth. But it seemed to be more, I don't know, kinder and non-dualist. You had churches like the AGC. You had Elaine Pagels was very popular, but she doesn't even mention the Gnostics. You had Timothy Freke and Peter Gandhi with their huge bestsellers, The Jesus Mysteries. But even though they were polemical, at the heart, they're really sort of like the Gnostic churches or Elaine Pagels, sort of nice, non-dualistic, positive sort of Gnostic movements. And it seems society has shifted, or what they really want is sort of that sort of rebellious Sethian edge to it. What do you think of this?
I think that's a really good point, because while writing my dissertation on the reception of the Nag Hammadi library, I was really struck by how the archons were so subdued, right? Sometimes they wouldn't even appear, like in Pagel's very famous text, or they'd be psychologized away. And it was largely about, in my dissertation, it's largely about finding an identity in relation to Christian symbols, which I think is true. But now, right, we're definitely seeing this sort of much darker vision. And the things that we were just talking about, I think, tap into that. Another thing that just popped in my head, I haven't sort of gone into this too deeply, and it's just sort of speculative, but the issue of the way social media ties into tribal mentality, right? So I'm guessing, I was too young, but I'm assuming that in the 80s and 90s, if one person in the family was on the right and one was on the left, you could have a conversation about politics and it wouldn't descend into, like, this person is a manifestation of pure evil.
It was much better. I remember. It was a lot more civil. You're right.
Yeah. And now, a lot of what the sort of political engines on both sides are doing is sort of tapping into that tribal mentality, this us versus them, we're this certain identity and they're lesser people, right, in some form or fashion, or they're silly, they're dumb, they're evil, right? So we're kind of on edge already if we're political creatures at all. So that has to be part of it as well.
Yeah, it's definitely ramped it up, and it should be noted that for any discussion of why Gnosticism might surge at certain periods, I mean, we could all speculate, changes in the geopolitical or strains in the geopolitical world and so forth. But somebody very important, and of course you have written about him, and that's Ian Culiano. And, of course, I love his book. The Tree of Gnosis is a book I go back and back again when I really need to sort of crystallize my ideas and get a sense of perspective. So maybe you could tell the audience about this very remarkable individual who really had a very tragic death. It might be, as some have said, the only time that a foreign government has assassinated a citizen on our soil, or an individual on our soil.
Yeah, his story is very sad in that sense. So he was out of Romania, right? And this is one of the reasons why Mircea Eliade, who is, probably the best known scholar of religion in the 20th century, right? He's just very well known, was, the head of the department in Chicago forever, and wrote, just dozens of books. Like, he's hugely, hugely important. And Culiano, started out, initially he was actually interested in Indian religions, which I find fascinating, but then he ended up getting into the study of early Christianity and Gnosticism while he was in grad school. And he wrote a dissertation on the Okemo, or this sort of spiritual body that one adopts in order to ascend. But he's one of these sort of early individuals that was studying things like Gnosticism and esotericism and Renaissance magic, and wrote splendid books on all of them. But I still think the Tree of Gnosis, as you were remarking, is the most important and interesting one, and very rich. And one of the things or the sort of central premise of the book is that, first off, as humans with human minds, there's certain limitations on what we're able to think, right? There's just, sort of parameters that our cognition will not go past. And secondly, that, again, as human beings in the world, we can come to certain ideas, and he calls these fourth dimensional and I think it gets misinterpreted a lot as like this sort of metaphysical thing, or in some way like, I don't know, somehow more powerful, or it has agency. I think what he's really saying is that, one of the things that we can come to as people is this idea of dualism, right? And he combines two things here. The first being that human beings are not made for this world, right? And this is in stark contrast to, say, Genesis, where, Adam is placed in the garden, right? And this is your world. You name the animals, right? In this sort of more orthodox reading. In dualism, we are not made for this world. This world is somehow antagonistic towards us. We're not at home. And the second point is that the creator deity, whoever it is, whoever created this world, does not have our best interests at heart, right? That he is, or she, is against us in some form or fashion. And this typically leads to the idea of there being a higher God above that who's actually, sort of beneficent or better. And those two ideas, and he points this out in the introduction, you can find that everywhere. Right, this is something that's universal. People can, from sort of tribal islanders to African religions to the Gnostics, can come to this sort of conclusion. And then once you do that, once that is sort of operative, a lot of things fall into place. Right, and so the ways in which the Gnostics, particularly who we would call the Sethians, or really the Ophites, because they're the ones who were reading Genesis and gave us this really radical reinterpretation of it, they kind of have to interpret it this way, right? Where if the creator deity is evil, well, that means in some form or fashion there must be a God above him. And if he was the one who created our body, there must be some part of us that is sort of transcendent of this, but it also makes our bodies sort of gripped in his world or in his prison in some form or fashion. And so anyway, Culiano sort of breaks that down, and the ways in which that idea fleshes itself out against sort of these Christian texts over time. And it's really beautiful, and I highly, and very intelligent, I highly recommend everybody read that book. But in the conclusion, and I think this is politically the really important part too, is that the point he's making is we have these ideas, and we look at religion as sort of the filling in of the interpretations that naturally follow from ideas that we'll come to. It sort of takes the investment out of the political side of this. Right, we're just sort of looking at it as these are the way ideas come out, right, and then they sort of become interpreted over time. Right, and so this, people dying for religious ideas become completely unthinkable, right? Because it's just this sort of formula, in a way. And yes, very soon after he published that book, he was, I believe it was stabbed to death, right, in a stall at the University of Chicago where he taught.
I have a friend actually, my friend Jim, who was actually on the campus then, and he was walking by and there's cops and all that, and he ran to, and yes, Ian was murdered in the bathroom. It was Romanian secret agents, because he'd written some antagonistic things about the new government. Of course, there are rumors that it was some sort of occult group, but we may never know. But it is a pity, because I would say Ian Culiano was really one of the great minds of our modern times.
And as a scholar of religion, he was just so spot on and really ahead of his time, I think. And I think people are sort of catching up to just how sort of rich his thought was in certain ways. And one of the other sort of interesting factoids about him, he wasn't a, like ritual magician in a sense, like he went into it, but he was just curious about this stuff. He's like, why do people do this stuff? And so as the story goes, he started like practicing stage magic and other things just to see like, what does this do? And so he would perform little tricks at parties and stuff like that. Just very pragmatic about it, right? Like, if I'm studying this stuff, I might as well look into it. Right?
Yes, I've heard for stories here in Chicago. He was really into the whole Giordano Bruno, the art of memory. So he'd study it, and he could go to a party and he could memorize, 100 people's names and their their births, and people would leave and come back, and then later he would just be able to recall everything. So I think, he was definitely tapping into some deep stuff, and he was a brilliant person. So it is, but it's good to keep his memory alive. And again, highly recommend the Tree of Gnosis for anybody looking for it.
Yeah, and Eros and Magic in the Renaissance is also great, just as an aside.
Yes, brilliant person. So let's get to some other great figures of modern Gnosticism, regardless of what the audience opinion are for them. And of course, this is based on your amazing paper that you did at Rice University. But let's talk about David Icke. And some people might say, well, he's just some sort of niche occult leader, this and that. But I think the truth is this: he does expound Gnostic ideas, and as you wrote, he can go to a stadium here in the USA and sell 6,000 tickets for seats. And also, as a recent poll came out, 12 million Americans believe in the lizard people. So Icke's ideas do have an impact, and they're very Gnostic, aren't they?
Oh, for sure. I had not heard about this poll. 12 million people signed up for the believing in the lizard people?
Yeah, I'll send you the link.
So
it's pretty recent.
Yeah, please do. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. When I came across David Icke, it was, again, in the context of just this reception history of ancient Gnostic texts and ideas. And so I got interested in his work that starts in about 2011, 2012, when he starts to use the term Archon, right? Before then, you have these lizard people, and he still refers to them as lizard people. This goes back and forth. It's complex, but the Archons really become this sort of foundational figure in his system at about 2012. And anyway, so part of what I was trying to do in that paper is look for, where do we see the Gnostic myth or the Gnostic idea of the Archons conveyed most literally, right? You know, not psychologized, not a metaphor, not existentialism, but like real, right? Like this literal interpretation. And I'm looking in a lot of places, and conspiracy theory ends up being the richest space for it. And so you see these direct translations and direct readings that, again, seem to, or for sure, pre-existed as knowledge of the Gnostics themselves, right? And these sorts of terms, which is interesting in its own right. But, you know, he has this idea of these Archons who are four-dimensional beings, right? So they're not material. They can't come onto our Earth physically without sort of great stress. And they inhabit the planet of Saturn, and they, in sort of prehistory, Atlantic history, they sort of genetically mutated human beings. So this is where we get into the anthropogeny in these sort of Sethian texts, and altered their DNA and their brains in certain important ways. The first one, and he seems to waffle on this, go back and forth, but they either magnified the reptilian brainstem or they implanted it whole, right? And the reptilian brainstem is the part of our brain that is really tapped into things like fear and fight or flight and anger, right? These sort of raw emotions. And these emotions, if they come from human beings, create energy, and that energy becomes food for the Archons, right? So they're essentially creating a food system by doing this to human beings. The second thing that he argues that they did is sort of manipulate our DNA or our CNS, actually, in a way that restricted our properties of sense, particularly our sense of vision, and restricted it to what we call the visible light spectrum. And so what they do, again, in his narrative, is they beam this sort of holographic world into us via light. Like the light works as information. And our CNS, or our brains, is kind of like a DVD. And the light coming from Saturn via the moon creates this sort of holographic world. And he's not saying that, you know, we don't have bodies. We clearly do, right? But we are sort of locked in this space where we're experiencing that sort of holographic reality. And one of the things that does is it occludes us from seeing the lizard people, right? This other race, this sort of hybrid race that was created in order to enslave human beings and keep them trapped in this world, keep them from recognizing their own human potential. He likes to use that language. But also to keep human beings sort of focusing their energy on the archons, again, so they get food. So how do they do that? They're in charge of economic systems. They create wars so that people will get in fights and die and have all these sort of terrible experiences, all of which functions as food for the archons. And in a very, very Gnostic way, in a sort of Gospel of Judas type Gnostic way, all of our conventional, traditional religions are actually manifestations or symbolic creations of the archons. And when humans are sort of worshiping Yahweh or Jesus, or they're circling the Kaaba or anything like that, they're focusing their energy on these solar symbols, as he understands it, and those essentially become conduits, so that our energy, our focus, our minds are feeding the archons, right? So let's pan back a little bit. We're genetically mutated by these alien beings who have created an entire system of reality, economically, politically, religiously, that is simply so that we feed them, right? We are completely ignorant of our own essential self-worth, our own real desires. And so, again, that could not be more Gnostic, right? And the trick is you have to find a way to wake up out of that. And with Icke, he talks about his own experiences of an ayahuasca vision, an ayahuasca trip that he goes on, I think in 2002 or something like that, and makes references to trying to raise the kundalini up to the heart chakra. And once you do that, the sort of phenomenological trap, that hologram that they've set up, will begin to dissolve, and we can see reality as it actually is.
Well said, good summary. And this is the interesting part, Matthew, is that in Icke's, I guess, cosmology or archonology, whatever you want to talk about, the archons feed on our negative emotions. And I think this is becoming more and more popular. Even Tessa Dick, Philip K. Dick's widow, she believes that the archons feed on our negative emotions. But I don't see that, unless I'm completely missing something, as very ancient Gnostic. It seems the archons of the Nag Hammadi library in Irenaeus are more like the archons of the Matrix. They need our energy to sustain the universe, regardless of what we're feeling. They feed on our souls or our minds.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, we don't have to be in pain or in fear or anything. The fact that we have the divine spark in us and we're trapped, whether we love life or not, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and well, I think the other sort of substantial shift there is that, at least in that sort of early Ophite anthropogony, the idea is they're trapping us because they want to steal the light, right? Like, that's what they're trying to get from us. They're trying to get the divine part because, again, they realize that, Yaldabaoth, you let it go, right, as you breathe it in. Right. And that's something that they want. They don't want our souls, right? They don't want that energy. They created that to keep us trapped so that they would have us in their little, sort of prison cave, exactly. And they could try and get the spark from us. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. And the idea of, like, feeding the moon with our energy, that if I recall a conversation that I had with Eric about this, you can see that in, like, Gurdjieff. So this is a later idea. All right, it's clearly something that it's feeding modern, contemporary, esoteric thought, but yeah, it's not in the ancient stuff.
Right. Well, you do have, I think, in the Manichaean myths, so when you rescue the light, it goes to the moon. It's a ship through the moon and all that. Yeah. But again, it has nothing to do with the man kicking us and making us feel bad and feeding off of our sorrow and all that. But it's still very interesting. I mean, I think we both agree there's nothing wrong with innovating Gnostic thought and giving it your own twist. That's what they did back then.
Yeah, it's inevitable too, right? Exactly. The idea that there is some sort of pristine, original, essential Gnostic thought, or any religion for that matter, frankly, that can then, sort of be perfectly copied and brought into the present is nonsense, right? Like these things that happen in the ancient world. The history of religions is a history of interpretation, right? Of, having these myths and ideas and rituals and practices, and those things are constantly being negotiated into new worlds, right? New places, new cultures. So it's going to happen with Gnosticism too. That's inevitable.
Yeah, I think that's well said. So let's talk about the other individual you discuss and have written about, and of course he is very influential today, and that is John Lamb Lash, and I interviewed him many years ago. I enjoyed Not in His Image. I know people would tell me, well, he's taking a lot of liberties with the Coptic translations, but I thought as a book and the mythology, it was a good read. Of course, he has pivoted to some dark places and so forth in the last few years. Yeah. But tell us how John Lamb Lash views the archons. Start with that.
Yeah. So, and let me preface this by saying, like, I too, when I read Not in His Image before I found out about this sort of dark turn that he had taken. And I thought it was really interesting, and having gone through all this research into the reception of the Nag Hammadi, it was really learned, right? Like, I disagree with it. There were some historical, riffs, right, that probably didn't belong, but it was a very sort of learned, interesting, thoughtful sort of redevelopment of Gnostic thought. But anyway, so his idea regarding the archons, he ties them also into aliens, all right? And in a similar way, Icke does, that you have the grays, all right? So these sort of more, well, I mean, the alien gray, like people are familiar with that idea. And then you have this more leonine sort of reptilian type form, and this is where DePauw comes in. But he sees them as viruses, right? And that this virus sort of entered into our human planet in the sort of primordial times, and he has a whole cosmogony back there. But it entered into our world through very, very early Judaism. Right? And so he goes back and he talks about the era of Melchizedek and how Melchizedek anointed Abraham. And that this was the beginning of this Zadokite cult, which was really a kind of archon religion, right? That ends up getting passed down through this sort of substream of Judaism. But then it comes to flourish at the time of Jesus. Right, because both Jesus and Paul in his memory are Zadokites. And through them, the archon virus infects the whole world. Right? So through Judeo-Christianity and eventually Islam, the archon virus goes into the world. And starts to sort of move out. And so he's very, very strongly skeptical and towards organized Judaism and organized Christianity. And he sees the ancient Gnostics not as Gnostic Christians. He's very against that term. But actually they were on the front lines against, they were the ones who saw that the archons were trying to take over the world through this sort of mind virus, through this myth that they had created around Jesus Christ. And but again, they were put to death in what he calls the Gnostic genocide. And so it was very important for the Nag Hammadi library to be resurrected or to be dug up, because it was this sort of reminder, again, this is all according to Lash, not me, that this is a virus that has insinuated itself into our culture and needs to be sort of fought against. Right? And that language of virus, of course, is very, very dangerous, right? When thought about humanistically, right?
And historically,
making that. I mean, I was just watching a documentary on Hitler last night because
he saw the Jews as a virus and a disease
and cancer, and yeah. It's very, very, very dangerous to do that. But that is, and I think talking about these reinterpretations of Gnostic thought, it's pretty difficult to go into the sort of ancient cosmology of the Earth at the center of the universe, right? Like, we can't do that anymore. And nor can we talk in terms of just like spirit, soul, and body. We have a much different understanding of how the body works. That includes viruses. Right? So the idea of bringing these sort of conversations around viruses or triune brain theory and the hippocampus and all that, like you see in Icke, is sort of inevitable too. Right? It's just a way that Gnosticism will be reinterpreted.
Yeah, agreed. But in Lash's cosmology, I believe, the Earth is Sophia, the Moon and the Sun are part of the light substance. And then, so what are the Archons exactly trying to do? What is their end game? Feeding on us, or what are these little parasites doing?
I just realized I went blank on that one. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So we don't know. Yeah, I was thinking, because I've had him on the show and I've read his book, and I'm like, what is the purpose of these Archons? I know it's not good, but well, we'll have to look into it.
Yeah, they're nefariously inclined, but
they're the bad
to remember,
guys.
like, what's the takeaways? Like, they're just bad, all right? Because they only, sorry, I would just be fleshing it out sort of verbally. I don't know off the top of my head what the purpose of these Archons are, right? Because they're not feeding on us in the same way.
Right. Well, I mean,
like
we study.
Like that.
Yeah, you and I, we study so much, sometimes it gets overlapping, just like the Nag Hammadi text.
Yeah.
Sometimes like, wait, is this in the origin of the world or hypostasis of the Archons? Damn it! I've got to go look this up. So this is bound to happen, and audience, let us know. But another individual, which I had never heard about at the Gnostic America conference, was Carol Reiner. And I was fascinated by her work. And we do know, because I was reading about her from your paper last night, what the end game of the Archons are, and that's to create genocide and reduce human population to 500 million. So they are the Archons are to eugenics, you might say. But maybe tell the audience a little bit about Carol Reiner and how you ran into her.
Yeah, so one of the things that I and this is a issue in scholarship that I think is really important when we're studying contemporary people. It's really important to look at self-published stuff, right? Because this is, they're not necessarily representative of an imprint or anything like that. They're just sort of a expression of how certain ideas are just out there, right? And so all Carl Reimer's work is self-published, and it could use an editor, but it's also very, very sort of rich and interesting. And she's influenced deeply by Lash and Icke, right? A lot of her understanding of the Gnostics is keyed into and informed by their work. And she had been an astrology consultant for a very, very long time, and I think still is, right? That's part of the way that she makes her money. But she started to take that very alt-right dark turn, and again, 2011 for some reason is a date that keeps popping up. And yeah, so the
Mayans, it's all, let's blame it on the Mayans.
That's it. There was actually a sort of major turn in 2012. We didn't see it, right? But it happened.
They let the Archons in.
Yeah, but so one of the things that I thought made her sort of really captivating is she had first that idea, as you were conveying, that the Archon's ultimate goal, because they do feed off of us, right? But they also don't need that many of us to do so. So the ultimate goal is genocide, getting rid of us. And this is a way of conceptualizing the Archons as responsible for pretty much everything, right? From chemtrails and the idea that vaccines are actually meant to sort of disable us or kill us rather than help us, or GMOs in the food. Again, these are ways of sort of manipulating us genetically. And in addition to that, she sees the rise of transhumanism as sort of fundamentally a archontic project. And by which I mean that the Archons don't have access to our ability to imagine, right? This ends up becoming the stand-in in a sort of way for what the divine spirit or spark was, right? We have the capacity to innovate, to imagine, to have this sort of rich inner thought. The Archons don't have that in her system, and they want to get that. Right, that's something that they're very much after. So if you follow transhumanism out, and it goes from being sort of mechanical limbs or organs or things of that nature to us becoming actual cyborgs, and there being mental processes that occur on silicon rather than within our actual neurology, that becomes a way to splice into the human being. Right, and splice into that consciousness and finally get out that sort of divine spark that, again, like we were talking about in the ancient texts, is what they were really after.
Fascinating stuff, and for the audience, definitely check her out. She's another one of those modern day...
She's not well known, yeah, but very interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm glad you found her again from a sort of to study how this stuff is moving and evolving. It's really interesting. So why don't we pivot to somebody who's not really, you might say, a Gnostic guru, although he is a personal guru of mine. I have no problem worshiping this individual, but he is definitely an artist, and that is the mighty Grant Morrison. Of course, I loved the Invisibles. I don't feel you read the Invisibles, you experience the Invisibles. So the audience who might not know, tell them a little bit about who Grant Morrison is, or specifically how he had himself an experience.
Yeah, so Grant Morrison is one of, I think, one of the more pivotal figures, but not as talked about as like a Philip K. Dick in their reception of Gnostic thought. And The Invisibles is one of the great masterpieces of modern Gnostic. It is wonderful. I could not recommend it more highly. It's one of those books that will zap you. Right? It is very, very sort of rich and electric in its way. So he's a fascinating person. So, and I won't get into the huge backstory. He was, by the time he was in his early 30s, he was very, very rich. He happened to publish a very good and highly received Batman comic, Arkham Asylum, at the same time that the Tim Burton, Jack Nicholson, Michael Keaton Batman came out. So he was just swimming in money at that point, like Scrooge McDuck. Just he was very, very rich at that point. And so he decides to go into this very interesting project. And I should back up momentarily. He had been straight edge from the time he was born, right until he was in his 30s. But when he was 19, he discovered Aleister Crowley. And since that point, he had been doing chaos magic. And by chaos magic, I mean that it was a very pragmatic view where he wasn't aligned with any one particular tradition. He would just try on different spells, different rituals, and see if they worked or not. And that would include fictional characters, like trying to summon Lovecraftian old ones and things like that, right? So he was, again, very imaginative and very interesting person already. But by the time he reaches his 30s, he wants to try this experiment. And it's basically, how much can fiction influence my own personal reality, right? Because he sees fiction as this kind of independent in its way, although we obviously interact with it, sort of reality, right? This other dimension, as it were. And so what he does is he starts to write himself as this character named King Mob, who, if you look in The Invisibles, looks very much like an idealized version of Grant Morrison at that time, with the shaved head and the sunglasses and the whole deal. And essentially he's just sort of writing what happens to King Mob, and it ends up reflecting into his life in these really interesting ways. He describes all these synchronicities where he writes King Mob meeting like a red-haired woman somewhere here, and then boom, he bumps into this redhead woman, right? And different things of that nature. But the really sort of most profound thing that happened to him at this time, and before this point, he wasn't really interested in Gnosticism, right? You see the use of terms like abraxas, right? But abraxas is everywhere, particularly in Jung, so that doesn't show familiarity with ancient Gnostics or anything like that. And he's in Kathmandu, India, because he's just traveling the world, and he's at the beginning of writing The Invisibles. And he runs to the top of this temple, and if you do it on a single lungful of air, you're promised enlightenment. He gets to the top, nothing happens. But he goes back to his hotel at the end of the night and takes a little bit of hash, And then suddenly the Swayambhunath temple, which is just across from his hotel, starts to metamorphose and transform itself into all these sort of conduits. And these, he calls them mercurial sprites, right, start to float along the ceiling and above him. And so he goes back to his hotel bedroom, very disoriented, obviously. And then they ask him, these mercurial sprites, as he tells the story, where do you want to go? And he says, Alpha Centauri. And so he gets taken to Alpha Centauri, and it's there, it's nice, whatever. But then they're like, now we need to show you the secret of the universe. And he talks about turning his mind, a very metanoia, right? And suddenly he's outside the universe, as he describes it, or space-time. And he's seeing all these sort of pink grid traceries, as he describes them, going in and out. And he talks to these mercurial hypersprites, these sort of divine beings, and asks them, what is that? And they say, well, that's the universe. So what's happening? And as they put it, universes are just where gods grow, right? The universes basically need time. And what you, as a human being, experiences, things like frustration or pain or good versus evil, right versus wrong, are all just the sort of engine of time working to develop a god. And this is sort of his induction into the armies of light, as he calls it in his biography. And this ends up feeding a lot of what ends up going into the Invisibles, this sort of enlightenment gnosis type experience. It's depicted in the first book, as it were. And yeah, so I'll stop there because you asked about the experience itself. So I don't know what direction you want to go.
Oh, God, so many directions. This is wonderful. I guess
yeah.
Before we get into the Invisibles, I wanted to ask you, this is fascinating because, again, I was reading your paper on Grant Morrison. And it's interesting, as you mentioned, he decided in a very chaos magic to sort of blur the boundary of fiction and reality. But then I'm thinking that's not so different than how Philip K. Dick did it, although I don't know if Dick really did it on purpose. It seems like it was a two-way street that he had no control over. And at the same time, too, then you look at somebody like Jung, who, again, when he was writing his art, which was the Red Book and the 7 Sermons to the Dead, again, the lines of fiction and reality were blurred because he was hearing voices and there was figures walking, knocking on the door in his house and all that. So it's very interesting that these 3 Gnostic figures, again, sort of the barrier between their fiction and reality were completely blurred. And I was starting to wonder, well, maybe that's how the ancient Gnostics just assumed it worked. I mean, what do you think about this idea?
Yeah, so that's, I think you put your finger on something very, very important there. And there's a couple different ways of looking at that. With Dick, I think you're right that it was not... With Morrison, it was a project that he wanted agency in. Right, this sort of self-creation in reference to story. And therefore, like, he was trying to write himself. Philip K. Dick, the Ballast trilogy is great, but when you get into the exegesis, like, this is a guy who is very brilliant and profound, mystical, but also very confused. Yeah. Right, like, these things are happening, and he's trying to figure out what to make of it, and he spends the whole of his life after 2374 trying to figure it out and throwing anything at the wall that he can to try and figure that out. And Jung goes into his, these active imagination experiences that end up becoming the Red Book. And right after he has them, he starts to interpret them, and these things all start to build. But I know this is the case with Morrison, and it comes out of Jung too, and Jung would have influenced PKD. One of the ideas about what Gnosticism is that becomes very, very popular in the 20th century, and that would be influential, especially with people that identify as Gnostic, without the Christianity part being super important, is this idea that the Gnostics were combinative sort of mythographers. Right. And a lot of what Gnosticism actually was this mythology of self-experience. They would have these deep experiences of the ontological self, the metaphysical self, that part of themselves that is God. And they would create myths on it, right, in the sense of trying to capture it in this very imagistic, symbolic, combinative way. And so they're using Genesis, and they're using Homer, and they're using, I get the Gospels. It's all over the place, right? But they're trying to find ways of essentially communicating that in an imagistic, sort of right brain sort of way. And so this idea that there's a very strong continuity between the mythology and experience end up centering or becoming foundational to how people understand Gnosticism. The book that Grant Morrison was interested in most, that gave him his idea of Gnosticism, was Gustavo Celerano's The History of Gnosticism, where that very idea of Gnosticism is there. Right? The Romantics and figures like that are also considered Gnostics, according to him. And so, takeaway from that, and this is what ends up being sort of Grant Morrison's implicit theory of religion, is that we're always, whether it's the sort of Orthodox stories, the Bible, whether it's Gnostic myths of the ancient world, or whether it's his own, these ideas or religions that we're creating, they're all at core stories. Right? They're all myths. But once we create those myths, they start to influence us in really powerful and potent ways. And we start to interact with them as stories, and those stories change our lives. Right? So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. Right? This sort of way in which the myth intersects with here.
Yes, indeed. And of course brings us to more or less Alan Moore and his ideas of art and consciousness. And of course, Morrison was influenced a lot by Philip K. Dick, so there we have this overlap.
Oh, yeah.
So, and The Invisibles, you would say, I mean, even when I first read it, I said, man, this is an amazing Manichaean tale from beginning to end. Would you agree with that, or how would you describe The Invisibles?
Yeah. It is Manichaean in the sense that you have these armies of light and the Invisibles versus these, the archons of the outer church. But the way it ends up shaking out, particularly by the end of book 3, is Grant Morrison is trying to point or indicate the revelation that he had, right, in Kathmandu. And part of what he's pointing to is that these archons and then these armies of light are really at core expressions of the same thing. Right? This is these antagonistic forces, when you pull back, are actually just what's necessary in order to create the God. Right, they're just an expression of the all now. And so there's this figure within the Invisibles that you can kind of trace. And by the end of the book, he actually comes out as a Gnostic, right? He's called the Gnostic, and he talks about all his books being destroyed at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And, he's trying to teach one of the lead characters, Dane, that through this game of chess, that you think as when you're fighting as the white against the black, that you're actually, trying to win something, when at the end of the day, it's all just a game. It's all just a board game, right? So with that, it's got this much more non-dualist sort of ultimate takeaway from it. But the actual sort of vividness of the story and the power of the story is in believing in that sort of army of light versus army of darkness as you go through it, which I guess makes it very Gnostic and very sort of mythological.
Well said, indeed. Well, I think we have come to the end. And again, I have had the pleasure of reading your writings, hearing you lecture, so I am blessed. But do you think we might know when the audiences might be blessed by some of your publications, or should we just have some faith instead of gnosis about this?
Yeah, and thank you for that. That's very kind. I have a couple articles that are up on my academia page that people are more willing to check out. I have an article on the Apostolic Johannite Church and Jeremy Puma that should be out early 2019. An article for the Gnostic Counterculture, Gnostic America, and the dissertation being revised into a book that will happen in time. Hopefully within the next year and a half. That'll be out. We'll see. Publications move slow.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. But we definitely look forward to that, and hopefully getting you back to see if these Gnostic days understand them a little bit more. But I'd like to thank you very much, Matthew, for coming on Aeon Byte. It's you've truly completed the show by your presence, since I know you've been a listener and you've been writing about this for many years.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've been researching Aeon Byte, in fact, for quite some time, so it's fun to participate.
Yeah, you're in the belly of the beast. You're the anthropologist who has come right in the middle of the tribe.
Yeah, exactly. But a participant observer, right? Now I'm actually a participant.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and we hope to have you on soon.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. The first part of our interview with Matthew Dillon on modern Gnostic cults and figures. The simulation really does break down when you write your own gospel and live your own myth. When I wrote my novels, not only were they autobiographical, but prescient. Sometimes for the worse, when I didn't pay attention to the missives of the collective unconscious. Zeus releases the Kraken when you're not looking. In our second part, Matthew discusses how paranoia and conspiracy theory play into all these mentioned characters and Gnosticism in general throughout history. We discuss some of the recent Gnostic scholarship. Is the term Gnosticism useful? What about dualism? Does that term make sense? And were the Gnostics truly dualists? Did the Cathars and other groups really exist? And were they Gnostic at all? Is Gnosticism a Christian phenomenon? Or does it go back to even more ancient times? Matthew also discusses Mary Magdalene and the role of women in modern Christianity. And much more. As mentioned in the intro, we will also include for members, beyond the complete show, our Trimorphic Paranoia, where Vance, a guest, and I offer a commentary on the interview. We are joined by Miguel Angel Sanchez, the artistic and writing force behind Starfish, Light the Dark, a truly amazing Gnostic graphic novel just released. Perfect for our topic with Matt. Our threesome really offers some electric views on Gnosticism in modern times and how it relates to your existence and how your fiction can become true. For the full interview and the Trimorphic Paranoia, please become a member or patron at Patreon. Just go to the God Above God Dead Cam on how to join and all the other cool benefits. Or message me. And as always, if you've got holes in your pockets due to Archon monkey shines, let me know, and I'll be glad to send you a full show on the burning house. In the end, your support solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. I may have sold part of my soul for the day gig, but my full spirit remains pure in this venture. In these darksome times when ignorance isn't bliss but death, and W.B. Yeats' The Second Coming truly is becoming manifest. Glad you're here. Glad we're in this together. Divided we stand, together we rise. We run with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it. And we don't get fooled again with the right gnosis. Hello and goodbye as always.